Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The curtains in the drawing room of Sycamore House were drawn tightly shut, despite the bright morning sun that had just crested over the rolling hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. Inside, the house was unnaturally silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards or the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was Mrs. Percival, the elderly housekeeper, who had made the dreadful discovery just past 8 o'clock, and since then no one had entered or left the house. In the master bedroom upstairs, Edith Grayson lay motionless on the rug before her writing desk, her lifeless body sprawled in a way that suggested she had collapsed suddenly. She was fully dressed, save for her shoes, which rested neatly beside the bed. No signs of struggle, no weapon in sight. The windows were latched from within. The door had been locked, and there was no other means of exit. Constable Reed stood in the hallway outside the room, flipping through his notebook, brow furrowed. A locked room mystery was bad enough, but this one had no blood, no sign of trauma, and most curiously, no immediate cause of death. Dr. Hayward had already examined the body and pronounced it natural causes, most likely cardiac. Yet he looked less than convinced. The woman's face had a strange, almost peaceful expression, and a faint whiff of lavender and something metallic lingered in the air. That wasn't the only oddity. There was a single item out of place in the room. A child's porcelain doll, seated squarely in the middle of the desk, its tiny glass eyes staring into the distance. No one could recall Edith ever owning such a doll. It had not been seen before, and Mrs. Percival swore she hadn't dusted it the day prior. The desk drawer in which it now sat had been locked. The key had been hanging on Edith's necklace when her body was found. Colonel Melchett had been called in, and after surveying the scene, muttered that it was beyond ordinary thinking, and left the local constabulary to file reports. Mrs. Grayson had lived alone since her brother's death 2 years ago. Her affairs were tidy, her habits meticulous. A spinster by choice, she rarely entertained. The few visitors she did receive were the vicar's wife, her solicitor, Mr. Henry Bellamy, and her niece Agnes, who lived in nearby Much Benham News of. The mystery spread through the village like wildfire, and it wasn't long before Miss Marple, quietly seated in her cottage garden, trimming deadheads from her roses, received a call from Constable Reed himself. A polite invitation, of course. The constable, though somewhat embarrassed to ask, had long since learned the value of Miss Marple's insight in matters where logic seemed to fray at the edges. Miss Marple arrived at Sycamore House in her usual blue coat and sensible hat, clutching a small notebook and gloves. She listened carefully to Constable Reed's summary of events, nodding quietly as he led her up the stairs to the bedroom. She paused at the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the shaded room. The doll on the desk caught her attention at once. She moved forward and examined it without touching. Porcelain, antique. Its dress was yellowing lace, probably Edwardian. A small crack ran from the corner of its painted mouth to its chin. Its arms were jointed but fixed in an upward position, as though meant to hold something once. A parasol or bouquet. There was something unnerving about it. But more than that, there was something wrong with the placement. The doll had been inside the drawer, the one that was locked. Edith had kept the drawer locked at all times, Mrs. Percival confirmed, and only used it for her will, private letters, and her bank book. Miss Marple asked quietly, "Was anything missing?" Mrs. Percival looked flustered. She hadn't checked. Mr. Bellamy, the solicitor, was sent for immediately. Meanwhile, Miss Marple turned her attention to the rest of the room. The cup on the nightstand had no residue. The sheets were smooth, unrumpled. A scarf lay neatly folded at the foot of the bed. The faint scent of lavender was strongest at the desk, yet not from the drawer. From the doll itself, as if it had been recently handled or sprayed, she inquired about recent visitors. Agnes had visited 2 days ago. The vicar's wife the week before. Mr. Bellamy came monthly and had been there just 6 days ago to update some documents. No one else. Edith rarely went out. The timeline seemed too narrow. Dr. Hayward had estimated the time of death between midnight and 3 in the morning. No sign of entry, no bruising, but a locked drawer opened from within, and a doll that had no reason to be there. Mr. Bellamy arrived just before noon and confirmed that the will had been recently updated, placing Agnes as the primary beneficiary. Everything matched except his copy had noted that Edith had included a letter to accompany the will, detailing her intentions and some troubling suspicions she had about a family heirloom that had vanished last year. That letter was missing. Miss Marple blinked slowly. Suspicious, she murmured, then turned once more to the doll. She asked for gloves and carefully examined the underside. A loose stitch. She tugged slightly. Inside the doll's hollow body was a rolled scrap of paper partially stained, bearing a shaky signature. Edith's. It was the missing letter, or part of it. Agnes, when questioned, expressed shock and grief, but Miss Marple had observed her carefully, especially when the doll was mentioned. Her eyes had lingered too long. The doll was part of Agnes's childhood, Miss Marple would later say. It had sat on the mantel of her old nursery in Much Benham. Agnes had brought it with her on her visit. Why? To hide something? Or to plant something? The question now was, had Edith died naturally, or had someone made it seem so? The mystery had only begun to unravel, and the doll, with its eerie presence and hollow core, was not the last secret Sycamore House would yield. Miss Marple stood silently by the writing desk, her gaze resting not on the eerie porcelain figure, but on the faint layer of dust disturbed on the drawer's edge. She hadn't touched it, yet something about the trail of dust caught her attention. A thin, uneven line, as though a cloth had been brushed across in haste. It was such a small thing, the kind one might miss entirely in the company of a dead body and a mysterious doll, but to Miss Marple it whispered of urgency, of someone covering tracks too quickly to be thorough. While Constable Reed continued scribbling notes and Dr. Hayward excused himself with quiet matters about scheduling, Miss Marple calmly asked if anyone had been in the house since Edith's death, aside from the staff and authorities. Mrs. Percival was firm. No one. The front door had been locked, and the side entrance was barred with a wooden beam. No keys were missing, and no windows appeared tampered with. Miss Marple nodded gently and asked to see the rest of the desk. Constable Reed hesitated but gave his approval. The drawers yielded the expected contents: paper, ink, a tidy bank ledger. But in the third drawer, tucked beneath an old blotting pad, she found a handkerchief with a monogram stitched in pale green. It was an A, ornate and curling. She held it up delicately. "This doesn't belong to Miss Grayson, does it?" Mrs. Percival shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am. She always used plain white linen, no fancy lettering." Miss Marple folded the handkerchief and placed it on the edge of the desk without comment. Downstairs, Agnes sat rigidly in the parlor, her gloved hands clutched around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She looked pale, the kind of pale that wasn't just grief, but tight-lipped calculation. When Miss Marple joined her, Agnes rose with practiced poise and offered condolences that felt overly rehearsed. "Aunt Edith was like a second mother to me," she said softly. "It's such a terrible shock." Miss Marple watched her a moment before responding with a pleasant, "Yes, dreadful. One never expects these things, do we?" Then, as if idly, she added, "I saw your childhood doll upstairs. Such a pretty thing." Agnes stiffened for a fraction of a second, not visibly, but enough. A flutter at the corner of her left eye. "Oh, yes. I'd forgotten all about it. I suppose Aunt Edith must have kept it as a memento." The words came a beat too slow, as though she had to make up the reason as she spoke. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Strange, though. Mrs. Percival doesn't recall ever seeing it." Agnes offered a small shrug. "She kept it locked away, I expect." Miss Marple changed the subject with a brief mention of the weather and the state of her roses, but the detail was filed away, her mental ledger growing. She returned upstairs and requested a moment alone in the room. Constable Reed granted it, though he clearly felt uncomfortable allowing an elderly woman to poke around a crime scene with such freedom. Still, his past experiences had taught him it was best to let Miss Marple work. Left in silence, Miss Marple inspected the small wooden box on the nightstand. It was a keepsake box, the type with faded velvet lining and a worn hinge. Inside were a few brooches, a faded photograph of a man in uniform, likely Edith's late brother, and a ribbon-bound packet of letters. She examined the photograph closely. The man had a familiar air, but the face told her nothing new. What drew her interest, however, was the ribbon. It had been tied unevenly, as if refastened in haste. She carefully opened the packet and noticed that 2 of the letters bore smudges of fresh lavender-scented oil, incongruous with the others. Someone had handled them recently. She checked the dates. Both were addressed to Edith, both from Agnes, and dated 3 years ago. The first letter was affectionate and filled with mundane gossip. The second was more emotional. Agnes had apparently requested a loan, a fairly large one, and apologized profusely for not having anywhere else to turn. Miss Marple considered the financial records Edith had so methodically maintained. There had been no sign of any recent transfer or cash withdrawal in large sums. If the money had been given, it had been done in private, without official trace. Or perhaps it had been refused. And if refused, had that rejection been remembered? She examined the doll again, this time carefully lifting the head. Inside the hollow porcelain neck, barely visible without the angle and light, was a tiny scrap of fabric. It was white linen, torn, jagged at the edge. She carefully extracted it with the end of a hairpin from her sleeve. The edge was stained faintly yellow, chemical, not age. Something bitter on the scent. Almond, not lavender. Cyanide, she thought, but subtle. She tucked the scrap into her notebook and closed it softly. When Constable Reed returned, she asked if they had tested the inside of the drawer or the doll for any traces of substance. He looked surprised. "No, ma'am, didn't seem necessary." Miss Marple nodded. It might be wise to check. Perhaps the doll wasn't just a keepsake. Downstairs, the solicitor, Mr. Bellamy, had returned to discuss arrangements. Miss Marple requested to speak with him privately. "You said Edith made changes to her will recently. Do you recall the phrasing of the letter that accompanied it?" Mr. Bellamy frowned and removed a small notebook. "I didn't read it in full, but she'd written about a personal betrayal. Said she no longer felt safe in her own home. I assumed it was paranoia. Did she mention anyone specifically?" He shook his head. only that someone she trusted had shown an unexpected capacity for cruelty. Miss Marple thanked him and turned away, eyes now focused not on the crime scene, but on its emotional undercurrents, the subtle violence of trust being eroded, of someone weaponizing sentiment and memory. When she returned home that evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in the sitting room, but the needles moved without focus. Her mind turned again and again to the image of the drawer, the doll, and the handkerchief with the green monogram. Not one of the authorities had asked why a woman so obsessively tidy would lock away a doll with no connection to her life. Not one had questioned how a drawer could be unlocked from inside a locked room. Someone had entered the room with the key. Someone Edith knew well enough to allow into her confidence. Someone who had the time and means to plant an object laced with poison. An object tied to the past and cloaked in sentiment, and that someone had slipped, not in the act, but in the cover-up. A monogram, a scent, a second too long of hesitation. It was not yet clear how the crime had been done. But the pieces were forming shapes. A delicate picture, feminine, precise and ruthless. Just like the doll itself. The morning after her quiet return from Sycamore House, Miss Marple penned a brief note and sent it off with young Tommy Bartlett, the paperboy, to the constable's office. It was a simple request to gather all who had seen or spoken to Edith Grayson in the 3 days leading up to her death. Within hours, arrangements were made for a series of informal conversations at the Vicarage Hall, a neutral place where people might feel less guarded. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, her notebook resting on her lap, her eyes as sharp and unassuming as ever. Mrs. Percival arrived first, clasping her handbag tightly and settling into the wooden chair across from Miss Marple with a stiff kind of formality. Her voice trembled slightly as she began. She was quiet that last day. Quieter than usual, I mean. I asked if she wanted her usual tea tray set out in the afternoon, and she just nodded, didn't speak a word. Miss Marple asked gently if Edith had received any letters or callers. "Not that I know of," she said, "but the post did come. Late. I left the letters on her desk. There were 2, I think." She frowned. "I only saw one there after the police came." "Did you read the post?" Miss Marple asked without accusation. "Oh, goodness, no." Mrs. Percival looked affronted. That would be terribly improper. But she avoided Miss Marple's eyes just briefly. A small flicker, enough. Not necessarily guilt, perhaps something else. Protectiveness, embarrassment, or fear. Next came the vicar's wife, Mrs. Holland, who was far more at ease. "Poor Edith, she never did like people fussing over her," she said, patting her hair. "I visited her on Tuesday just for a short call. I brought her some church pamphlets trying to coax her back to the parish garden club. She seemed distracted." Miss Marple asked if Edith mentioned any troubles. "She did ask after Agnes. Wanted to know if I thought she seemed different lately. I said no, of course. Though between us, I did think she looked thinner. Pale, nervy." She leaned in slightly. "They had a row recently, didn't they?" "Did she say that?" Miss Marple asked. "Not directly. Just hinted. Said something about foolish attachments and ungrateful girls." I didn't pry. When Agnes entered, her steps were soft, her expression solemn. She had changed into darker clothing, though the cuffs of her blouse were still stitched with delicate green thread. She sat carefully, hands folded, and answered each question with the measured precision of someone deeply aware she was being observed. She claimed she hadn't spoken to her aunt the day before her death. only visited on Monday to bring a box of shortbread and a gardening book Edith had lent her weeks before. She was cold, Agnes said. She barely looked at me. I think she'd already made up her mind. About what? Miss Marple asked. She told me not to expect anything, Agnes replied, eyes fixed on her lap. Said I had disappointed her. A pause, then. I suppose she meant the loan. I'd asked for help. She refused. Her voice was neutral, but her jaw clenched ever so slightly. I went home that evening and didn't go back. Did she say why she wouldn't help you? She said I reminded her of someone who took too much. And you never returned to the house after that? No, Agnes said. Miss Marple let the silence hang a moment longer than necessary. Do you often wear green, Miss Grayson? Agnes blinked, confused. Green? That thread on your blouse. Unusual shade. Agnes glanced down. Oh, I hadn't noticed. Next came Mr. Henry Bellamy, the solicitor, who appeared harried but composed. He brought his ledger and confirmed once again that the will had been updated 2 weeks prior. Miss Grayson was firm, he said. She wanted Agnes to inherit everything: home, money, possessions. But she also insisted the accompanying letter be preserved with it. Miss Marple asked if he had seen the contents of the letter. Not entirely. She said it was personal. She simply wanted it read alongside the will. It's gone, of course. He tapped the desk. Removed from the drawer. It's troubling. Do you know if anyone else knew about the letter? Only me and Miss Grayson. You never mentioned it to Agnes. His lips thinned. Certainly not. By mid-afternoon, a clearer picture had begun to take shape, but the contradictions sat uneasily. Mrs. Percival insisted she had left 2 letters on Edith's desk, but only one was found. Mrs. Holland hinted at recent tension and suspected a falling out, though Agnes claimed she hadn't spoken to her aunt since the Monday visit, and Agnes herself, poised and sorrowful, had failed to explain why a handkerchief bearing her initial was hidden in a drawer that hadn't been opened, at least not without the key found around the victim's neck. Miss Marple returned briefly to Sycamore House with Constable Reed to examine the house's interior once more, this time focusing on the path from the front entrance to the master bedroom. The carpet held no impressions of recent visitors, no signs of damp dirt, or even moved rugs. But near the threshold of the room, just at the edge of the doorframe, a faint smudge of wax caught Miss Marple's eye. Candle wax, pale blue, near, invisible unless one was searching. She did not speak of it aloud, not yet. Instead, she requested the constable ask if any candles were missing from the sideboard drawers. Back at the vicarage hall, Mrs. Percival lingered in the doorway as the session closed. Her voice was quiet. There was one thing, she said. I didn't want to say it in front of everyone. Miss Marple encouraged her to continue. That Monday, after Agnes left, I saw Miss Grayson go upstairs with something in her hands. A small box, velvet, like a jewelry case. She looked upset. I didn't ask. Did the box reappear? No, I haven't seen it since. Miss Marple pressed her fingers together thoughtfully. A jewelry case, possibly holding the family heirloom mentioned in the letter. Or perhaps the missing poison. If poison had indeed been used. That evening, as the sun dipped over the hedgerows and cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her garden window once more. The contradictions hummed in her thoughts. Small, subtle dissonances that suggested more than one person had something to hide. Agnes's mournful restraint, Mrs. Percival's quiet avoidance, the solicitor's polite distance. All of them had presented versions of events that seemed just close enough to truth to be believable, but each had left something out. And within those omissions, she sensed the outline of the answer beginning to take shape. A lie, buried beneath layers of grief and performance. A secret, kept alive not by silence, but by the manipulation of what little had been spoken aloud. By the following day, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted from mourning to murmurs. Behind drawn curtains and over teacups, speculation thrived. Sycamore House no longer felt like the residence of a quiet spinster. It had become the center of a puzzle with no obvious shape. Yet at the edge of this chattering village, Miss Marple moved quietly through her garden, trimming back the hydrangeas and thinking, always thinking. The suspects had all spoken their truths, yet each version of events carried a flaw, small enough to slip past casual scrutiny, but not past hers. She began assembling the pieces not as a list of statements, but as a tapestry of intentions. Motive, after all, was never a single thread. It was a weave of emotion, opportunity, and necessity, and here each suspect held a thread of their own. Agnes had the clearest motive, financial desperation. The request for a loan had not only been refused, but Miss Grayson had gone further, questioning her character, threatening to amend the will again. But was financial pressure alone enough to kill? Agnes had inherited everything under the current will. If Edith had truly died naturally, Agnes stood to gain without lifting a finger. And yet, the doll, the monogrammed handkerchief, the missing, these weren't the marks of passivity. They hinted at orchestration. Mrs. Percival, the devoted housekeeper, had shown subtle signs of fear, or perhaps guilt. Her version of events didn't directly implicate her, yet she had faltered over small details. Letters left on the desk, the missing jewelry case. She had access to the house at all hours and intimate knowledge of Edith's habits. What if she had seen something she dared not speak of? Fear could silence even the most loyal servant. Or perhaps she was complicit, not through malice, but protection. But whom was she protecting? Mr. Bellamy's involvement was less personal but no less curious. He had access to sensitive documents, including the revised will and the mysterious letter. If the letter vanished before or after the death, would he not have reported it more urgently? Unless, of course, its contents threatened to unravel something larger. Miss Marple recalled his exact phrasing. Edith had mentioned someone she trusted showing an unexpected capacity for cruelty. That was more than disappointment. That was betrayal. Was Mr. Bellamy protecting someone too? And then there was the doll itself, a symbol of innocence twisted into a vessel of deceit. It wasn't simply planted as a distraction. It was deliberately hidden inside a locked drawer, one that could only be accessed with the key around Edith's neck. Unless Edith herself placed it there, someone must have retrieved the key after death or before. That alone narrowed the list. Only someone close, someone trusted, could have approached her without alarm. Miss Marple requested Constable Reed's assistance once again, asking him to retrieve the list of items from the property's last inventory, conducted shortly after Edith's brother died. Among the records, one item stood out: a silver locket containing a miniature portrait and a lock of hair, noted as sentimental value only. The locket was not among Edith's effects now, nor was it in her jewelry box or the safe in the study. It had vanished without mention. Miss Marple considered the missing locket and the velvet box described by Mrs. Percival. The connection seemed likely. The heirloom, possibly the source of the rift between Edith and Agnes, was no longer part of the estate. If Edith had discovered it missing and suspected someone close to her, the letter to Mr. Bellamy would make sense, as would her sudden change in demeanor. That afternoon, Miss Marple asked to see Agnes once again, this time under the pretense of offering comfort. They sat in the small parlour of the vicarage, where Agnes had taken temporary residence until the estate's matters were resolved. Miss Marple commented on the weather, the roses, and finally, with a soft pause, asked, "Do you remember the locket?" Agnes blinked. "The one with Uncle Frederick's hair?" "Yes. Your aunt kept it by her bedside for years. Strange that it wasn't among her belongings." Agnes hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "I suppose she might have misplaced it." "Unlikely, don't you think?" Edith was precise. "And yet the locket, like the letter, is gone, as is the box Mrs. Percival saw her carrying." Agnes stood abruptly. "Why are you asking me this? I told you I wasn't there after Monday." Miss Marple remained seated, voice calm. "Of course. But if your aunt discovered the locket missing on Monday evening, she would have had reason to write something urgent. Perhaps even confront the person she suspected. Perhaps she locked the doll away to keep it hidden, not realizing it held something inside." Agnes's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "You see, my dear," Miss Marple continued gently, "this isn't about proving who had a motive. It's about untangling who believed they were about to lose something. An inheritance, a reputation, or even the last thread of trust that held a family together." Agnes said nothing. Her eyes dropped to the floor. That evening, Miss Marple met Constable Reed at Sycamore House once more. Together they searched the garden shed and the attic. In the attic, behind a stack of old crates, they found a velvet box. Inside was the locket, open, the portrait cracked. Beneath it, a folded scrap of paper, a note in Edith's hand. "This is not hers. It was taken. I know now." There was no name, but the implication was clear. Edith had been robbed of something deeply personal. Not for money, but perhaps for spite. For ownership. The web of motives was now complete. Agnes, desperate and angry. Mrs. Percival, perhaps loyal to Edith to a fault, but clearly aware of something dark. Mr. Bellamy, whose silence spoke of deeper complications. But there was still one missing. Link, the method. A clean body, no marks, no signs of struggle. Only the scent of lavender, and that faint, bitter trace of almonds. Miss Marple stood quietly in the attic, turning the velvet box over in her hands. She imagined Edith discovering the locket missing, writing her final words, sealing the doll, placing the letter, then preparing herself for confrontation. Had she invited someone to the house that night? Someone she trusted just enough. Tomorrow, she would speak again to Dr. Hayward. There were still tests to run. But she now understood the heart of the matter. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime born of erosion, of strained loyalty, twisted inheritance, and years of subtle bitterness calcified into quiet malice. The following morning brought a cold sharpness to the air, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The news travelled swiftly. Constable Reed had made an arrest. It was Mrs. Percival. The locket discovered in the attic had been traced back to a recent transaction. A pawn shop in Basingstoke had logged an inquiry 3 weeks earlier, submitted by phone, requesting an appraisal for a silver locket with a miniature portrait. The shopkeeper had taken the call but claimed the item was never brought in. The voice he remembered was elderly, polite, nervous, a woman, unmistakably. Mrs. Percival fit the description. She had no alibi for the evening in question, and had quietly left the house for nearly an hour after supper, an errand she'd never mentioned. Worse still, a search of her quarters revealed a wax-stained hand towel, matching the residue found near the bedroom threshold. The reaction from the village was swift and divided. Some muttered that it was always the quiet ones, the ones who seemed too loyal. Others defended her, claiming she had served Miss Grayson for over 20 years and wouldn't have hurt a fly. But in official eyes, the pieces aligned too neatly. Motive: resentment over being left out of the will. Opportunity: unmonitored access to the victim's room. Evidence: the wax residue, the towel, the unaccounted absence. It seemed damning. The constable issued the statement by mid-afternoon. Pending toxicology, they had a suspect in custody, but Miss Marple, seated in her parlour with a pot of tea growing cold beside her, did not celebrate. She stared at the embers in her fireplace, thinking not of wax or towels but of timing. The pawn-shop call had come weeks before Edith's death, and the locket had never changed hands. Why contact a pawn-shop at all, unless the caller planned to sell? But the locket had been found tucked away, hidden, not sold, or even prepared for sale. If Mrs. Percival had wanted to profit, why hide the item in the attic where she herself resided? And then there was the doll, the method, a poison delivery hidden in sentiment, in innocence. That did not feel like the act of a servant. It felt curated, layered. She returned to Sycamore House one last time before dusk. The constable allowed her entry with mild reluctance, but he had learned to trust her instincts, even if he didn't understand them. She walked slowly through the corridor into the bedroom and paused again before the writing desk. Everything had been returned to order, almost. One item sat slightly out of place, the blotting pad. It had been moved, perhaps during the earlier search, perhaps before. Miss Marple opened the drawer again. Inside were only ink and paper, but her fingers brushed a thin groove along the underside, barely noticeable. She followed it with her eyes and saw that the drawer had been removed and reinserted at some point. That wouldn't have mattered, unless someone had needed to insert something from beneath, something tucked inside the hollow lip. She knelt down, tracing along the lower ridge of the desk. Nothing. She stood slowly and stepped to the bed. The covers had been turned back earlier by the forensic team. She lifted the pillow. Underneath it, as thin as parchment, lay a folded note. It was not addressed or sealed, but when opened, it read only 2 lines. She is not who she seems. Watch her hands, always her hands. The handwriting matched Edith's. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and slipped it into her coat. She left without fanfare and returned to her home, where she placed the note beside the fragment of linen retrieved from the doll. Her suspicions had begun to coalesce into something more dangerous than she had anticipated. Someone had staged this crime with care, and then waited quietly as the wrong person was accused. Someone had planted a monogrammed handkerchief, drawn attention to a pawnshop call, and let Mrs. Percival bear the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple didn't sleep that night. Instead, she wrote 3 letters. One to Dr. Hayward, requesting immediate clarification on the toxicology tests. One to Mr. Bellamy, inquiring about the exact wording of the insurance documents. And one to Agnes. The last letter was brief and politely worded, inviting her to tea the following afternoon. It was signed simply, with a flourish and a time. Chew. Next day arrived with clear skies and a deceptive calm. Agnes appeared at the door on time, dressed neatly but plainly. She smiled with the soft restraint of someone trying to keep sorrow from becoming spectacle. They exchanged pleasantries and Miss Marple poured the tea, offering biscuits. The conversation began gently, drifting over weather, village gossip and recent books. Then, as if recalling something trivial, Miss Marple asked, "Did you ever keep a diary, dear? I remember your aunt mentioning it once. Said you were always scribbling as a girl." Agnes hesitated, eyes narrowing for half a breath. "Not for years." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Shame. Diaries are curious things. They hold truths we don't mean to tell." She leaned forward slightly. "I found a note, written by your aunt. It wasn't addressed, but I believe it was about someone close to her, someone she no longer trusted." Agnes set down her teacup with careful precision. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Not at all," she replied gently. "But I do think your aunt knew something, was wrong, something that made her afraid, even of you." Agnes stood. Her eyes were cold now, the softness gone. "I've answered your questions. I've been polite. But I don't have to endure these insinuations." Miss Marple remained seated, watching her carefully. "It was clever," she said softly, "to lace the doll with poison, to wait until your aunt handled it, to replace the letter with a fake distraction. But you were too careful. You let things lie just long enough for someone else to be blamed." Agnes said nothing. Her lips were tight, her hands clenched. Miss Marple noted them, trembling not with fear, but with fury. Controlled fury. The kind that plans. "You wore gloves when you brought the doll, didn't you? But afterward, you forgot to collect something you left behind. A handkerchief, monogrammed. And then, days before, a call to a pawn shop about a locket you knew your aunt would never sell. All to lay a trail." Agnes's voice came quiet but firm. "You can't prove any of this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, not yet, but I will. Because the poison's trace is still in the doll's fabric. And the letter your aunt hid beneath her pillow is in Dr. Hayward's hands now. The handwriting, the wording, it's very precise. Like you." Agnes turned without another word and left the cottage. Miss Marple sat still. Outside, the wind stirred the garden, soft but persistent. She knew now the case was far from over. Agnes had slipped once, but she would not slip again so easily. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces left, behind, the real battle had begun. Not of evidence, but of patience. The false victory was done. The real truth was waiting for its moment. The air in St. Mary Mead had taken on a restless quality, as if even the trees suspected that something was not yet finished. Though the constabulary stood firm behind Mrs. Percival's arrest, murmurs of doubt lingered just beneath the surface. And among the handful of villagers who had learned not to take things at face value, a quiet watchfulness began to stir. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such undercurrents, found her thoughts returning, again and again, not just to Edith's death but to what had preceded it. Events too distant to seem relevant and yet too unresolved to ignore. It was in the back of the St. Mary Mead library that she found the missing thread. She hadn't meant to linger long, just to glance at the archives while waiting for Dr. Hayward's reply. But as her gloved hands skimmed along the old parish, ledgers, one name caught her eye. Grayson, Frederick. The entry dated back nearly 12 years, marked with a brief notice from the county records office. Inquest concluded, accidental fall from horseback. No foul play suspected. That much Miss Marple remembered vaguely. Frederick Grayson, Edith's younger brother, had died suddenly and with little ceremony. He had been a man of private habits, no wife, no children. His death, though abrupt, hadn't stirred suspicion at the time. But something about the notation struck her now, because beneath it, in a different hand, was a small marginalia added in faded ink. See incident, Pile Brentwood stable thefts 6 months prior. She followed that trail through the brittle folders of the village records and eventually to a thin, neglected file kept in the back of the old clerk's cabinet. It detailed a string of thefts from a local horse training facility. Expensive gear, coins, even a few prized medals from a locked display. Suspicion had hovered briefly over Frederick, who had taken to frequenting the grounds during his long convalescence, but nothing was proven, and no charges were ever laid. The investigation had faded as quickly as it emerged, but Miss Marple remembered something else now. Frederick's sudden decision to stay with Edith permanently, abandoning his post at the Brentwood facility without explanation. She left the library with her notebook full and her mind whirring. That evening, she retrieved Edith's old photograph, the one from the keepsake box, with Frederick in uniform. She stared at it longer this time. There was a subtle disquiet to his expression, as if the smile had been carefully chosen but not deeply felt. And then she remembered Agnes, barely 20 at the time of his death, sent abroad for schooling shortly after. Her return to St. Mary Mead, years later, had gone largely unnoticed by most, except Edith. Had that return reawakened something long buried? Miss Marple requested a meeting with Mr. Bellamy the following day under the pretense of clarifying legal matters. When he arrived, his usual composure seemed ever so slightly thinner. She greeted him warmly, then handed him a folder with the Brentwood theft summary. "I found this in the village archive," she said lightly. "I imagine it never crossed your desk when Frederick's affairs were closed." He glanced over the file, eyes tightening. "No, I don't recall ever seeing this." "Odd. Why bring it up now?" "Because it seems to me that Edith never truly believed Frederick's fall was accidental," she said, studying him. "And I suspect the missing locket was tied to more than sentiment, perhaps guilt, perhaps blackmail. Either way, it connects to something older, something that never quite healed." Bellamy folded the paper slowly. "You're suggesting the crime was rooted in what happened a decade ago?" "I'm suggesting that what happened then left a scar. And scars, when pressed hard enough, often bleed again." He didn't respond immediately, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something behind his silence, not shock, but recognition. As if he, too, had begun to suspect that Edith's death wasn't just an isolated act of malice, but the culmination of a secret kept too long. Later that evening, Miss Marple paid an unannounced visit to Agnes. The young woman answered the door with the same poised restraint as before, but her eyes betrayed irritation at the intrusion. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to share something I remembered." Agnes didn't respond, but stepped aside to let her in. They sat in the narrow sitting room, its lace curtains filtering the last of the sunlight. "You were quite close to your Uncle Frederick, weren't you?" Miss Marple began softly. Agnes's expression remained unreadable. He was kind to me. And after his death, your aunt sent you abroad. Rather suddenly. She thought I needed perspective. She thought you needed distance. Miss Marple corrected gently. She believed you were involved in something. Something tied to her brother's fall from grace. Or perhaps she feared that you were being influenced. Either way, she separated you from whatever pain lingered in this village. But pain doesn't vanish with distance. Agnes said nothing. Miss Marple continued. I believe Edith discovered something recently. Something that forced her to revisit that old chapter. Perhaps the locket was part of it. Perhaps a letter. But whatever it was, it reminded her that the past was not safely buried. Agnes's hands tightened in her lap. You have no proof of anything. No, Miss Marple agreed. But I do have a sense. Your aunt didn't just fear being hurt. She feared being betrayed again. And she knew how betrayal felt. That's what the note beneath her pillow said, didn't it? Watch her hands. Your hands. The way you present yourself, so composed, so elegant, and yet so cold. Agnes's voice was low now, bitter. You want to believe that because it makes for a tidy story. I want to understand why someone would go to such lengths, Miss Marple said. To poison a doll, to fabricate clues, to hide a history. Because this was never just about money, was it? It was about resentment. The kind that festers when someone's legacy threatens to outlive their sins. Agnes stood, her composure, faltering just for a breath. This conversation is over. Miss Marple didn't resist. She gathered her things slowly. It may be, she said, but the past rarely stays silent forever. Especially when the wrong person is sitting in a jail cell. She left the house quietly. The certainty had settled in her chest like weight. This wasn't a simple story of inheritance or envy. It was a story born in shadow. Of a family secret, a stained reputation, and a young woman who learned early that silence could be used as a weapon just as easily as poison. All that remained now was to bring the truth into light before the next silence fell. The next morning, the sun broke across St. Mary Mead in a pale shimmer, gilding the hedges and thatched roofs in gold. But inside Miss Marple's cottage, the warmth of the day did nothing to dispel the heavy fog of doubt still clinging to the investigation. Mrs. Percival remained in custody, and although whispers of her innocence now circulated, the constabulary lacked cause to release her without an alternate suspect. The evidence had been neat, too neat, and Miss Marple knew that only the one who had planted it could explain why. She sat quietly at her writing desk, knitting untouched beside her, and flipped back through her small notebook. Every page recorded, with a terse entry, a time, a name, a contradiction. But it wasn't the facts she returned to, it was the absences, the unspoken things, the way Agnes had deflected, the way Mr. Bellamy had withheld. She needed more than intuition. She needed a crack, not in the evidence, but in the facade. By midday, she had devised a plan. Not one that would hold in a courtroom, perhaps, but one that might provoke the one thing she needed most, an uncontrolled reaction. She sent out 2 notes. The first to Mr. Bellamy, requesting a meeting at Sycamore House under the pretense of locating an overlooked legal document. The second, more carefully worded, to Agnes, mentioning that new items had surfaced among her aunt's personal effects, including a revised will Miss Marple intended to review with the solicitor. The note closed with an invitation to join them, in case any clarifications were needed. She signed it plainly and sent it off without delay. At precisely 4 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at Sycamore House. She entered the drawing room and made sure to open the curtains fully, letting the sharp light pour in across the polished floorboards. She arranged 2 chairs and laid out a stack of documents, not real but convincing enough, on the side table near the fire. She then seated herself and waited. Mr. Bellamy arrived first, punctual as ever, carrying his leather briefcase and a look of practiced composure. He greeted her politely, asked no questions, and took the seat she indicated. Agnes arrived 10 minutes later. Her steps were brisk, her eyes alert, but she masked it with a veneer of calm. She greeted Mr. Bellamy with a nod and took the seat opposite him. "You said a revised will?" she asked, her voice even. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Not in the formal sense, but a handwritten addendum, found among a stack of papers in a drawer that had stuck shut." Mr. Bellamy looked at her sharply. "I don't recall a drawer being reported as stuck." "No, indeed," she answered mildly. "But it must have jammed during the initial handling. Fortunately, it's since been freed." She turned to Agnes. "Your aunt left a note quite specific. It outlines a change of beneficiary." Agnes stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Only that she had reconsidered certain decisions. In fact, she mentioned the locket, and someone named by initials. Not yours, surprisingly." Mr. Bellamy cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Do you have the note now?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not with me. It's in the hands of someone who's examining the ink for age consistency, but I did find something else, something more curious than even the letter." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in muslin. Inside was the doll, recovered, cleaned, but untouched chemically. She set it on the table gently. "This, as you know, was found in your aunt's desk drawer. I've made no changes to it. But I did speak to someone in London who specializes in restoration of such items, and she pointed out something I missed." Agnes said nothing. Her eyes had narrowed slightly. Miss Marple continued. "The lace on the doll's collar is handmade, very fine and extremely rare. It's from a workshop that closed nearly 10 years ago in Belgium. They only sold a dozen dolls like it. Each one was uniquely dressed and catalogued." Agnes exhaled sharply just once, but it was enough. Mr. Bellamy turned toward her with an expression of dawning confusion. Miss Marple leaned forward. "This doll wasn't Edith's. It was yours, wasn't it? Brought back with you. Not a gift, but a tool." Agnes opened her mouth, closed it again. The air in the room had shifted. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I understand how you might feel. Your uncle's reputation destroyed. Your own exile. Your aunt, cold and exacting, denying your pain. Perhaps you even blamed her for his death." Agnes's eyes flashed and her voice cracked. "He died because of shame. She left him to rot. She tried to protect you," Miss Marple said gently. "She sent you away to give you a future. And yet you returned, thinking she'd never change the will. That even after all those years, you could have your piece of what was lost. She lied to me," Agnes hissed. "She said she'd make it right, but she was going to take it back. Everything." Mr. Bellamy rose slowly from his chair. "Agnes." "She read my letters," Agnes said, rising too. "She kept them. She planned to change it again. Said I was just like him. Just like Frederick. She locked the doll away because she realized it had been tampered with," Miss Marple said quietly. "She didn't want to confront you, not directly, but She feared you'd already acted. And she was right, wasn't she? Agnes stood frozen, breathing shallowly, the mask now cracked in too many places to hold. For the first time, the silence in the room wasn't polite. It was final. Outside, the late light had begun to dim, and the soft clang of the church bell in the distance marked the half-hour. Mr. Bellamy moved slowly toward the door, clearly shaken, and Miss Marple stood with him. Agnes remained where she was, no longer pretending. And in her stillness, Miss Marple saw the truth. Not a violent mind, but one cornered by old wounds, by the weight of a broken past carried too long. The test had worked, not through law or science, but through a story too close to the truth for her to endure. Miss Marple offered no final judgment as she left. She knew the next steps belonged to others. Her part had been to turn the key and wait for the door to swing open. The evening after Agnes's outburst at Sycamore House, a quiet urgency settled over St. Mary Mead. Word had not yet reached the general public. Miss Marple had seen to that. But within the walls of the constabulary, and among a few trusted individuals, the atmosphere had changed. Miss Marple had shown her hand, and in doing so revealed Agnes's emotional fracture. But emotion wasn't guilt, it wasn't confession. And there was still no solid evidence to hold Agnes to what everyone now suspected. The poison, the placement of the doll, the missing letter, all critical and all circumstantial. Worse, the doll itself, that silent courier of death, was still the strongest physical link. And Miss Marple had kept it safe, wrapped carefully in muslin and sealed in a cabinet drawer beside her fireside chair, away from curious eyes. But that night, as she stirred from light sleep around midnight, something felt wrong. The house was still, no wind outside, no creak of floorboards, but the air seemed displaced, disturbed. She rose quietly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and descended the stairs without switching on the lights. Her footsteps made no sound on the rug. When she reached the sitting room, she paused at the threshold. The window to the right of the hearth was unlatched. A fine, muddy smear marked the sill. She crossed to the cabinet. The drawer was slightly open, empty. The doll was gone. She did not cry out. She did not gasp. She stood there still as stone, staring at the absence. Her thoughts moved faster than panic. Someone had come into her house, not to harm her, but to destroy, to silence. And they had succeeded. The next morning, Constable Reed listened with tight lips as Miss Marple explained the break-in. He inspected the latch, the drawer, the footprint beneath the window. Light step, he muttered. Bootprints shallow, small. Woman's likely. But he looked troubled. We should have moved it into evidence, he added quietly. We didn't think. No. Miss Marple interrupted gently. We did think. We just didn't realize how far she'd go. She didn't say Agnes's name, but they both understood. With the doll gone, the only physical link to the method, the lace collar, the faint chemical traces, was lost. The case, which had begun to take form like a mist revealing its shape, at dawn, now threatened to dissolve entirely again. And it wasn't just the doll. By noon, Miss Marple received another troubling report. Dr. Hayward had called. The note from under Edith's pillow, which he had sent to a laboratory in London for ink analysis, had never arrived. The parcel, posted 3 days earlier, was confirmed lost in transit. Vanished somewhere between the St. Mary Mead postal office and the city courier centre. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with the vicar's wife that afternoon, sipping warm tea and staring at the roses with vacant eyes. "It's almost clever," she said softly. "Not the theft itself, but the timing. She let us get just close enough to doubt, to suspect, and now the rug's been pulled." She tapped her gloved fingers against the teacup. "We've been played." The vicar's wife leaned in. "Could it have been someone else? Not Agnes?" "She panicked yesterday. That wasn't a performance. But that doesn't mean she acted alone. Or even first." Miss Marple stood and gazed toward the narrow lane that wound past Sycamore House. Someone else might have helped her. Or someone else may have something to lose if the truth comes out. That evening, she paid a second quieter visit to Mr. Bellamy. He received her in his study, a modest but carefully arranged room lined with books and framed documents. She declined tea and sat opposite him with her hands folded in her lap. "She came to you, didn't she?" she asked gently. "After yesterday." Bellamy's expression flickered, then settled. "You're implying I had something to do with what happened last night." "I'm not implying anything yet," Miss Marple said. "But I do know Agnes doesn't have keys to my house. And I do know you still hold influence at the county records office, perhaps even access to transit logs." "She was desperate," he said quietly. "I didn't know what she would do. I certainly didn't think she'd steal from you." He looked away. "But she came last night, shaken, said she had to erase the last lie." Miss Marple's voice was low. "She didn't erase it, she confirmed it. And you helped her." He looked tired now. "She's all that's left of that family. If this goes public, she'll do worse than vanish dolls and letters." "She's sick, Miss Marple. She's been sick for years." "No," Miss Marple said, rising. "She's dangerous. And now she knows she's being hunted." Bellamy's shoulders sagged, but he didn't speak. As Miss Marple turned to leave, he called softly after her, "Be careful." "I always am," she said. But she knew that wasn't entirely true. She had trusted logic and timing, and someone had slipped through the cracks. Now the case sat again on the brink, without evidence, without confession, only a trail of broken truth scattered through the village like fallen leaves. That night she moved her correspondence, her notes, and every scrap of memory she had recorded into a locked iron chest in her pantry. Then she sat in the parlor in her usual chair, a candle burning low, and watched the shadows move across the walls. She didn't sleep. She waited, because someone had reached into her home once, and someone would try again, not just to erase what was left, but to see if they could still stay ahead. But Miss Marple, for all her softness, was never 2 steps behind. And even in the absence of evidence, even when trust faltered and the case turned to vapor, she held fast to one belief: the truth, once touched, leaves fingerprints, no matter how carefully someone tries to wipe them away. The dawn crept slowly over St. Mary Mead, pale and grey, as if the village itself was reluctant to rise. Miss Marple, still seated in her parlor chair, hadn't moved in hours. The candle had long since burned out, leaving a curl of wax along the brass holder's edge. But she had not dozed. Her thoughts remained fixed, circling the same conclusion. From every angle, someone had removed the doll with precision and erased the note in transit, not in panic but in strategy. Agnes had been the emotional center, yes, but the coordination, the timing, suggested something more complex. A mind not only cruel but patient, and patience rarely acted alone. At 7:30, Constable Reed knocked on her door with an expression that struck her instantly as wrong. She opened it before he could speak, her eyes already narrowing. "There's been an incident," he said quietly. She didn't interrupt, letting the silence press him forward. "It's Bellamy. He's dead." She stood still, the words landing not with shock, but a cold, settling weight. She stepped aside, letting the constable in, and only then asked, "Where?" "In his office. The staff found him early this morning. His neck was broken. Looked like a fall from the top of the stairs, but—" He paused, then added with quiet certainty, "It wasn't a fall." Miss Marple listened without blinking. And Agnes? Gone. Not at her lodgings, not at the estate. No signs of struggle. Her room was tidy, empty, no packed bags, just Dawn. Miss Marple turned away, eyes cast toward the quiet garden beyond her kitchen window. "He tried to protect her," she murmured, "but perhaps he knew too much. Or tried to stop her, finally." Reed exhaled, then reached into his coat and held out an envelope. "This was on Bellamy's desk, addressed to you." She took it carefully, opened it in silence, and read the contents with her lips pressed into a firm line. The letter was brief, written in Mr. Bellamy's elegant hand. "I believed I could manage her. I thought guilt was enough to hold her back, but I was wrong. She's unraveling, and I fear now what she might do. If anything happens to me, look behind the frame in her old nursery. There's something there Edith never found." Miss Marple folded the letter once and placed it in her apron pocket. "We need to go to Sycamore House," she said. The constable drove. The roads were still, the early hour too fresh for gossip to have spread. When they arrived, the front gate stood slightly ajar, though the house itself showed no signs of disturbance. Inside, the dust settled gently in the air caught in shafts of early sunlight. Miss Marple moved with practiced steps, climbing the stairs to the east wing, where Agnes had once been a child, and where her old nursery remained sealed in time. The room was untouched. A child's bookcase, faded wallpaper of bluebells, and a worn rocking chair sat in their old places. Miss Marple moved to the framed watercolor above the fireplace, a painting of a garden path, simple and pastoral. She reached behind it, fingers sweeping the wood. A click. A shallow recess opened. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. She took it out carefully and opened to the middle, where a folded paper was tucked between the pages. It was a letter, aged but intact, signed by Frederick Grayson. Dated the week before his death. Miss Marple read the first lines, her breath catching only slightly. "I cannot carry this alone any longer. Agnes saw what happened. She took the medal. I tried to stop her, but she said if I spoke, she'd tell them I forced her." The rest of the letter was more fragmented. Ramblings, shame, a sense of collapse. But it was clear now. Frederick had been protecting someone, not the other way around. Agnes, barely 17 at the time, had committed one of the Brentwood thefts. Possibly more. And when the walls began to close in, she had used her uncle's vulnerability to shield herself. He had taken the fall. Literally. Miss Marple closed the journal and turned to Constable Reed, who had stood quietly at the doorway. "She's done this before," she said. "Not murder, perhaps, not directly. But she's used others as shields. Frederick, Bellamy, Edith." Reed nodded grimly. "So where would she run now?" "Some place where she feels untouchable. Or Perhaps, Miss Marple's voice lowered, some place where she can strike again. They returned to the constabulary and sent out alerts to neighboring villages and train stations. But by nightfall, there had been no sightings, no purchases, no witnesses. Agnes had disappeared into the countryside like mist. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire again, her hands resting in her lap. The room was quiet, the kettle long cooled, and yet she did not sleep. Something was unfinished, something more than escape. Agnes had destroyed the doll, erased the letter, eliminated Bellamy. But each act had been controlled, contained. Until, now, the following morning brought confirmation. A letter arrived at the vicarage, unmarked. Inside was a single page, typed. The words were cold, calculated. You want the truth, but you only see what you expect. There are no monsters here, only those left behind. She took everything, my uncle, my life, I simply took it back. You should have stayed out of it, don't follow. Miss Marple read the note once, twice, then passed it to Constable Reed without a word. He scanned it, jaw clenched. It's not over. No, Miss Marple said, standing. She's not finished. And now, she wants us to know it. The second crime had shattered any illusion of closure. And as the village stirred once more, with whispers and worry, Miss Marple understood that the case had changed shape. It was no longer about solving Edith Grayson's death. It was about stopping Agnes before she chose her next silence. And this time, Miss Marple would not wait for the storm to return. She would step into it. The morning after Bellamy's death brought with it a false calm. The village of St. Mary Mead moved on as it always had. Milk delivered to doors, curtains twitched, gossip murmured in low tones near hedgerows. But beneath the surface, there was an unease that hadn't existed before. Edith Grayson's death had been puzzling. The theft of the doll and the vanishing of the note had been troubling. But Bellamy's murder, cold, precise and calculated, had changed everything. Now it was no longer a village curiosity, it was fear. And yet fear had a way of clarifying things. Miss Marple, after receiving the typed letter that promised more silence to come, had remained unshaken on the surface. She had taken her tea, tended her garden, even fed the birds, as she always did. But all the while, her thoughts circled something that had begun to nudge at the edges of her memory, an unfinished idea, a thread that hadn't yet found its place. It had to do with Agnes, yes, but not just her motives or her anger. It had to do with her habits. She recalled their last conversation in the sitting room, the way Agnes had reacted to the doll's origin, the subtle shift in her voice when Belgium had been mentioned. But it wasn't just the doll. It was the phrasing Agnes had used. She said I was just like him. It had felt rehearsed, repeated, too convenient. At the time, Miss Marple had taken it at face value. But now, it began to feel like a planted sentiment. Not emotion, but manipulation. Agnes had known which memories to trigger, which wounds to poke. She fetched her notebook again and began flipping through the pages, interviews, observations, timelines. And there it was. Something she hadn't thought twice about at the time. A remark from Mrs. Holland, the vicar's wife. She was asking after Agnes. Said she seemed different lately. I said no, though between us, I did think she looked thinner. Pale, nervy. Pale, nervy. Not grief-stricken, Not angry. Nervy. It wasn't unusual, but combined with something else she had just remembered. A misplaced object. Long forgotten. It shifted into focus. Miss Marple rose from her chair and crossed the sitting room to her sewing drawer. She had nearly thrown it away a week ago. A small cloth satchel embroidered in green. She'd found it beneath the bench in Sycamore House during one of her early visits, presumed it to be one of Edith's sewing pieces. She'd meant to return it, but in the flurry of events it had been tucked away. Now she retrieved it and opened it carefully. Inside were remnants of dried lavender, but also something else. A tightly folded square of foil. At first glance, it seemed to be the inner wrapping of a chocolate. But it wasn't. It was from a medicinal lozenge, imported. A Belgian label still faintly readable. Miss Marple returned to her desk and searched her records. She found what she needed in a letter Agnes had written to Edith months earlier, preserved in Edith's correspondence. The writing was casual, full of harmless chatter about a trip to Brussels. She had mentioned bringing back gifts, but nowhere did she mention dolls or lace, but now the trip took on a different light. If Agnes had made contact with old acquaintances there, if she had access to obscure items, medications, or packaging, then the foreign chemical trace in the doll's fabric began to make sense. The scent, the bitter edge. It hadn't been an over-the-counter substance. It had been imported, carefully chosen. She checked the wrapper again and held it to the light. There was a tiny puncture on one side. Not torn. Pierced. A syringe, perhaps. A method of transport. If Agnes had used a soft consumable or coated something inside with toxin, the delivery would have been invisible until the recipient came into contact with it. Miss Marple sat back and exhaled slowly. Then another memory returned. During the interview with Mrs. Percival, she'd said she was quiet that day, didn't want her tea, but she had a mint, one of those soft lozenges, said her throat was scratchy. At the time, Miss Marple had dismissed it. But now, with the foil wrapper in hand and the residue in the doll, the connection was clear. Edith hadn't been poisoned by contact. She'd been lured into ingesting something hidden inside a lozenge or layered in a gift she thought harmless. The doll had been a decoy, not the method, but the mask. While all eyes were focused on the strange object in the locked drawer, the real weapon had slipped by in plain sight. The elegance of it was chilling. Miss Marple rose and contacted Dr. Hayward immediately. She requested access to the remaining contents of Edith's bedside table, including any waste discarded from the days prior to her death. By the time the constable escorted her to Sycamore House later that day, her certainty had solidified. In the wastebasket beside Edith's bed, beneath a crumpled tissue and old tea tags, was a second foil square. Same size, same puncture, same foreign label. She turned to Constable Reed. "This was it," she said. "She didn't touch the doll that night she took this. Agnes gave it to her. Probably during her final visit told her it was for her throat. It wasn't. She planned the doll as misdirection all along. But then why poison the lozenge if she thought she'd inherit everything anyway? Because she feared Edith was about to change the will again. And Agnes knew that Edith, once pushed far enough, would follow through. She acted before that could happen." Reed stared at the foil. "And Bellamy?" "He found out, or suspected, tried to keep her from spiraling. But he wasn't strong enough to stop her once she knew he'd read the journal. The pattern was finally clear. Not just the method, but the sequence. The narrative Agnes had crafted and controlled with precision. Misdirection, silence, erasure. But woven through it all were the signs, the doll with its fine lace meant to catch the eye, the letter that conveniently disappeared, the story of being wronged, told just enough times to earn sympathy and deflect suspicion. She had played the village's compassion like a violin. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of the house one last time before leaving. The air had turned colder now, the light thinner. "She's not gone far," she said softly. "She wants to see how the story ends." And now that the pattern had emerged, Miss Marple knew exactly where to look next. The wind carried the scent of turning leaves through the lanes of St. Mary Mead, the edges of summer curling brown as the village slipped toward autumn. But inside Miss Marple's parlour, the air was motionless, held still by the weight of what had finally come into focus. The pattern was clear now, not just the method or the players, but the reason. And the reason, as she had begun to suspect, was not what anyone thought. The foil wrappers, the fabricated evidence, the vanished heirloom. It had all been clever, calculated. But there had been something off from the very beginning, long before Edith Grayson's death. Something about Agnes's performance that hadn't matched the expected bitterness of someone merely cut from a will. Miss Marple had seen it before, people reacting out of greed or revenge, often recklessly. But Agnes had not been reckless. She had been deliberate. The kind of deliberate that suggested something deeper, something colder. It was Constable Reed who received the report first, an inquiry from the authorities in Brussels. They'd followed up on the information Miss Marple had quietly requested days ago, cross-referencing Agnes's travel record with local pharmacy, purchases and personal history. What returned wasn't just an invoice or receipt. It was a psychiatric referral. 2 years ago, Agnes had spent 3 months at a private mental health facility just outside Ghent. The reason listed: obsessive behavioral disorder, impulse control concerns, personality dissociation. There had been no criminal record, no formal treatment. She'd checked herself out early, claiming improvement, and returned to England. No one had asked. No one had known. Miss Marple sat in the library of Sycamore House again, reading the summary in silence. The cracks she had sensed in Agnes's presentation, her tight control, her reactive fury, her fixation on Edith, were no longer questions. They were symptoms. Later that afternoon, she walked through the house alone. Constable Reed had posted a patrol at the gate, but Miss Marple had requested time inside. She needed to see the space again, not the crime scene but the home, Edith's world, and Agnes's. She climbed the stairs and passed the master bedroom, lingering at the threshold of the nursery. Inside, the same faint scent of lavender hung in the air, though its source was long removed. She stepped inside and knelt before the toy chest. It hadn't been opened in years, but Miss Marple suspected Edith hadn't had the heart to empty it. Inside were old dolls, a stuffed bear, and a crumbling sketch pad. Miss Marple lifted the pad and opened to the first page. Childlike drawings, crude outlines of people and animals. But midway through, something changed. The sketches became darker. A figure with sharp eyes appeared repeatedly, another with a tall frame and crooked smile. Words were scribbled next to them. She hides. He lies. I know what they did. These were not ordinary childhood doodles. They were remnants of something Agnes had lived with, perhaps long before anyone had noticed. And as Miss Marple studied the page, she began to understand. This wasn't about the will. It had never been. Agnes had believed she was wronged, not because she was left out, but because her entire existence had been shaped by secrets she had no control over. Her fixation with Edith was not merely inheritance, it was identity. Agnes had been raised under the shadow of her uncle's disgrace, then sent away, then brought back as a stranger in her own home. Edith, who had tried to contain the damage, had become the embodiment of the thing Agnes resented most. The gatekeeper of truth, the one who decided what was remembered and what was forgotten. Miss Marple turned to leave and paused at the door. Agnes hadn't run because she feared capture. She had vanished because she hadn't yet finished telling her story. That evening, a letter arrived at the constable's office. Hand-delivered by a passing postman who'd found it in the village drop-box with no return address. It was addressed to Miss Marple. Inside was a single page, typed again, but this time more personal. You always saw the doll, not the child. You saw the note, not the silence. She made me into this, not with cruelty, but with control. I was never allowed to be broken. I was just dismissed, like a smudge on the window she couldn't polish out. I didn't want her money. I wanted the past undone. I wanted to break something that wouldn't mend. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her notebook. She didn't speak for a while. The lamplight flickered against the glass of the window pane, catching her reflection just faintly. Then she turned to Constable. Read. We need to go back to the place where she hid the doll, she said. Not because we'll find anything, but because she wants us to. There's something else she left behind. They returned to Sycamore House, to the desk in the master bedroom. Miss Marple opened the drawer slowly. It had been emptied weeks ago, but now she pressed her fingers against the false bottom she'd discovered earlier. This time, there was something new. A photograph. It was of Agnes, aged 10, standing between her Uncle Frederick and Edith. Her uncle had a hand on her shoulder. Edith stood at a slight distance. Agnes's expression was blank, not smiling, not sad, just empty. On the back, a message was scrawled in thick pencil. This was the day everything ended. You saw it. You did nothing. Miss Marple held the photo tightly, the edges slightly frayed. She understood now. Agnes had not killed out of hunger or spite or entitlement. She had killed out of erasure. A lifetime of it. Moments that had been rewritten, covered in polite silence, until only the illusion of family remained. She had grown up being managed, not heard. And when she finally demanded to be seen, she did so not by reclaiming her place, but by burning it to ash. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, the photograph in her hand, and finally said quietly, "We were all looking for reason, in a mind that never knew calm. And now we're chasing someone who doesn't want to disappear. She wants to be remembered, even if only for what she destroyed." The true motive had nothing to do with legacy. It had everything to do with identity, twisted, blurred, and buried. Under the weight of silence, Agnes hadn't run because she was afraid. She'd run because, for the first time, she had finally become real. The air in St. Mary Mead was thick with unease, the kind that clings to the back of the neck and refuses to lift even in daylight. News of Bellamy's death had travelled quietly but decisively. And though the village hadn't yet descended into panic, it no longer walked in innocence. Miss Marple ever composed, moved through her days with a new precision, each step chosen with care, each word measured. Agnes was still gone, her absence a shadow stretched over everything, but the time for waiting had passed. Miss Marple had seen enough, heard enough, and now she was ready. Not for another search or another clue, but for the ending. It was never just about Edith or the will. It was about someone who had felt invisible and who, in trying to be seen, had turned herself into something unrecognizable. And Miss Marple, for all her gentleness, knew that sometimes the only way to stop a storm was to step into its path. She asked Constable Reed to gather a few key individuals quietly, Mrs. Holland, Dr. Hayward, and one of the constables from the Bellamy investigation. Not to share theories, but to be present. She wanted witnesses. If Agnes returned, and she would, there needed to be eyes that saw the truth as it unfolded. And so, under the pretense of reviewing Edith Grayson's estate, and formally closing the house, Miss Marple arranged a final gathering at Sycamore House. She made no secret of her presence. A light in the parlor window, a fire lit early, tea on the tray, and the front door left ever so slightly ajar. She sat alone in the parlor as dusk turned the garden to grey. No knitting, no books, just waiting. The knock came just after 7. It was soft. 2 taps, barely louder than the rustle of leaves outside. Miss Marple didn't move at first. Then she rose, walked to the door, and opened it. Agnes stood on the threshold. Her coat was dark, her hair pinned neatly, as if she had just come from the village shop. Her eyes, however, were distant, tight with something far beyond exhaustion. She stepped inside without a word. Miss Marple closed the door behind her. Agnes looked around the room slowly. "You left the lights on. I wanted you to feel welcome. You think this is over? I think it can be." Agnes took a breath but didn't sit. She stood by the fireplace, eyes flickering across the mantel, the bookshelf, the framed photograph of Edith that now stood beside a vase of dried flowers. "I was never going to run," she said. "Not really. I know. I just wanted, for once, I wanted someone to see me before the story ended. They've seen you now." Agnes turned her head slowly. "They've seen what I did, not who I am." "They've seen both," Miss Marple said gently. "And so have I." The silence held for a long moment, and when Agnes finally sat, it wasn't surrender. It was release. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I never meant to kill her. Not at first. I just wanted to scare her, remind her, make her think about what she'd buried." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "But when you gave her the lozenge, you knew what it contained." "I knew it wouldn't hurt right away. I thought she might feel sick, frightened. I wanted her to be afraid of what I could do. And Bellamy." Agnes flinched, her eyes glassing. "He was supposed to help, he always helped, but he started pulling away. He said I was going too far, that I should turn myself in. He called me unstable." "Did you push him?" Agnes didn't speak for several seconds. Then a quiet, flat voice. "He lost his balance." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "But you didn't call for help?" "No. Because in that moment, he became like all the rest. Just another person trying to control you." Agnes didn't respond, but the answer was in her stillness. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly to the window outside. She could see the faint silhouette of Constable Reed standing near the gate, just where she'd asked him to be. "I found the journal in the nursery," she said softly. "And the letter your uncle wrote. I know what happened." Agnes closed her eyes. "You were a child," Miss Marple continued. "You made a mistake. You stole something. But your uncle, he didn't protect you. He let you carry the blame in silence. He let me believe it was my fault," Agnes said bitterly. "Said he would fix it, then made it worse. He told Edith, and she sent me away. Treated me like I was damaged, like I didn't belong. And you came back thinking you could rebuild something. She never let me forget," Agnes whispered. "Every polite smile, every locked drawer, every change to the will. She controlled everything, even her forgiveness." Miss Marple turned from the window and faced her. "You're not wrong to want a voice. At the moment you used silence to hurt others, you became the very thing you were trying to destroy." Agnes stared at her. Then slowly, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She held it out. Miss Marple took it and read it silently. It was a confession of everything. The lozenge, the planted handkerchief, the staged letter that never arrived, Bellamy's death. "I wrote it last night," Agnes said. "I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd burn it. But I didn't." "Because you want someone to read it," Miss Marple said. "Because I'm tired," Agnes answered. The sound of a car approaching broke the silence. Headlights swept briefly across the curtains. Constable Reed would be at the door soon. Agnes stood slowly. "Will they take me away tonight?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not as a monster. As a person who was finally seen." Agnes nodded once. No fight, no attempt to flee. And as the door opened behind her, as Constable Reed stepped into the room and gently took her by the arm, Agnes looked back only once, toward Miss Marple, who stood still, kind, unwavering. The detective said nothing. She didn't have to. The truth was whole now, and the silence, at last, had spoken. The wind had picked up by the time Constable Reed led Agnes away, a sharp breeze rustling the hedgerows and sending dry leaves across the path, like whispers of what had passed. Inside Sycamore House, silence fell with finality. Miss Marple remained by the window long after the car's tail lights had vanished beyond the bend. Agnes had gone quietly, offering no resistance, no apology, only the confession folded like a fragile truth in Miss Marple's hand. For all the pain, for all the damage, it had ended without violence. Or so it seemed. She returned to the parlor and sank into her chair, not with satisfaction, but with the solemn calm of someone who had weathered a storm she never wished to see again. Her teacup, untouched since earlier that afternoon, sat cold on the tray. The confession would be handed over soon, of course, but for now it rested beside her, the last piece in a long, jagged puzzle. And yet something hovered. Not doubt exactly, but disquiet. Agnes's account had been detailed. She had laid bare her resentment, her intent, even the delivery of poison. It matched the facts. But one thing in particular had struck Miss Marple. Not in the moment, but now, in the echo of reflection. "I just wanted her to be afraid," Agnes had said. "Remind her. Make her think about what she'd buried, not what she did. Not what she caused, what she buried." Miss Marple leaned forward and opened the confession again, scanning Agnes's words. Everything centered on Edith. Her control, her coldness, her judgment. But the locket, the missing one. Agnes had never mentioned it, not even in her full confession, nor the real content of the letter Edith had hidden beneath her pillow. She had acknowledged staging the scene, manipulating the timing, even orchestrating Bellamy's death, but she had never once claimed to have read that final letter, which meant she didn't know what was in it. And that, Miss Marple realized, with a chill, changed everything. She rose quickly and crossed to the fireplace. The copy of Edith's letter, transcribed from Bellamy's earlier reading, sat in her notes. It had always puzzled her slightly. Edith's phrasing, her cryptic allusions to betrayal and something taken. Miss Marple had believed, like everyone else, that it referred to Agnes. But now, reading it again, the emphasis fell differently. Someone close. I trusted him once. Now I keep it locked. He says it's nothing, but I know what I saw. If anything happens to me, don't ask Agnes. Ask him, not her. Him. Miss Marple turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. Bellamy had read the letter weeks ago. He had claimed not to remember the wording clearly, had described Edith's concerns as paranoia, had withheld the letter entirely until it was too late. He had said he wanted to protect Agnes. But what if it wasn't just Agnes? What if he was protecting himself? She left Sycamore House at once and walked briskly to the constabulary. The night clerk, surprised by her sudden arrival, granted her access to the evidence locker under Constable Reed's prior authorization. She asked for the original copy of Edith's journal, the one Bellamy had kept hidden in the nursery for years. She was led into a back room and the box was retrieved. She opened the journal carefully. Toward the back, beneath the better-known entries and crossed-out passages, were several pages Edith had pasted in from older letters and documents. And on one page, nearly overlooked, was a note dated 3 years prior, signed not by Agnes or Edith, but by Bellamy himself. It was a personal note, brief and oddly emotional for a solicitor. You were right to question me. I should have told you. I didn't mean for her to find it, but it's done. It's hidden now, and no one else needs to know. If you choose to rewrite things, I'll accept it. But please, don't destroy me over one mistake. Miss Marple's breath caught. This wasn't about Agnes at all. It had never been about Agnes. She turned and asked the clerk for Bellamy's case file, any records retrieved after his death. It had been a quiet investigation with only surface-level detail reviewed, due to the assumption of Agnes's guilt. But when Miss Marple requested his personal effects, the clerk produced a sealed envelope found in his coat pocket the night he died. It was addressed simply, to be opened only if necessary. Inside was a folded, sheet-typed, a draft of a revised will, Edith's, dated earlier than the one Bellamy had filed. And in it, the beneficiary was not Agnes. It was Bellamy. Miss Marple stood frozen. Edith had intended to cut Agnes out, yes, but she had also reconsidered, leaving anything to her solicitor, and this draft made it clear. She had drafted a new will naming a charitable trust as the sole beneficiary. Bellamy had known. He had never filed it. Instead, he had hidden it, perhaps thinking Edith would forget. But she hadn't. She had confronted him, and that was what she had meant in the letter. I trusted him once. Now I keep it locked. Bellamy hadn't just covered up Agnes's outburst or tried to protect her mental state. He had kept critical legal documents from surfacing. And when Edith began to question him, when she hinted at exposing his manipulation, he had panicked. But he couldn't stop Edith without making it obvious. So he waited, and when Agnes acted, when she delivered the lozenge, staged the doll, built her trap, Bellamy saw the perfect cover. He hadn't killed Edith, but he had used her death to erase the final threat to his deception. He had encouraged suspicion toward Agnes, helped frame the narrative, and when she grew unstable, when she spoke too openly, he'd acted again. This time, directly. Miss Marple lowered the document slowly. She had believed herself to have seen the full shape of the crime, but the final piece had been lying flat beneath it all along. Agnes was guilty of one death, and of her spiraling, desperate attempt to be heard, but Bellamy had been playing both sides of the mirror, and now he was dead. Not by fate. By consequence, Miss Marple stepped out into the night, the wind sharp against her cheek. The truth at last had been unearthed not with drama, but with quiet gravity. One final twist, one last deception, and it had been hiding in plain sight all along. The following morning broke grey and quiet, with a thin mist trailing along the village lanes like a shroud not yet lifted. Inside the constabulary, the final threads of the case lay spread across a long table. Bellamy's hidden will, Edith's letter, Agnes's confession, all pieces of a puzzle that, until the night before, had seemed locked into place. Miss Marple sat calmly across from Constable Reed, her posture relaxed, her voice low as she explained what no one else had seen clearly. Agnes believed she was the center of it, she said. And in many ways she was. Her actions were real. Her pain was real. But the framing of the crime, the trail of misdirection, the ease with which she was implicated, that wasn't entirely hers. Bellamy saw what was happening, and instead of intervening, he stepped aside and let it play out. Because it served him. Reed glanced again at the letter found in Bellamy's coat. She was going to cut him out. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and more than that, she was going to expose his manipulation. She may have finally uncovered that he suppressed her earlier draft. That, I believe, was what pushed her to write that final letter and place it beneath her pillow. She knew something was coming, but he didn't poison her, Reed said. No. But he knew she had been poisoned, Miss Marple said evenly. And he said nothing. He let her die. And when suspicion fell on Agnes, he simply stood in the shadow, quietly rearranging details to ensure it stayed that way. Reed's jaw tightened. And then when Agnes started cracking, he got rid of her too. Miss Marple nodded. I believe she confronted him, perhaps even threatened to expose everything. But he had already chosen the path of least resistance. He'd committed one silent act of destruction. A second came just as easily. Outside, the village moved slowly, unaware that the final answer had slipped through its hedgerows. There would be no trial for Bellamy, no statement, no courtroom, no confession. But the truth had settled, weighty and complete. Even if justice, by its formal name, would never be served to the one who deserved it most. Agnes remained in custody, awaiting psychological evaluation. Miss Marple had already written a letter to the court-appointed solicitor, urging compassion. The confession, however detailed, was incomplete. It showed guilt, yes, but also damage, trauma stitched over in silence and left to rot. And while the law would find its language for that, Miss Marple hoped they would remember that punishment did not always equal justice. Later that day, she returned to Sycamore House one final time. It had already been scheduled for sale, the estate prepared for transition, but she had one last task to complete. She entered the drawing room and crossed to the writing desk where it had all begun. The surface gleamed, recently polished, but the drawer, once locked, once hiding the doll, remained slightly ajar. She pulled it open. Inside was a single key, not to the desk, but to the garden shed. She took it and walked out across the overgrown path to the back of the house. The shed's door creaked as it opened, revealing little more than tools, pots, and a rusted watering can. But in the corner, beneath a sheet, was a wooden crate. She knelt, lifted the cover, and found what Edith had likely meant to reveal, an old leather folder labeled with Bellamy's name. Inside were copies of financial ledgers, receipts, and dates, small discrepancies, clever manipulations, all carefully recorded. She had discovered them quietly, prepared to confront him legally. But he had moved faster. Not with malice at first, but with calculation. Miss Marple gathered the documents and left the shed, locking the door behind her. That evening she returned to her cottage and placed everything, confession, letter, ledger, into a single box, wrapped it, and labeled it plainly for the solicitor now assigned to finalize the estate. She included a note in her precise handwriting. The full truth, even when inconvenient, remains the only safeguard for the future. And then, as twilight settled in, she poured herself a modest cup of tea and sat by the fire. The quiet returned, not emptiness, but balance. The crime had been revealed, the victims acknowledged, and the silence broken. But justice had moved in strange ways this time. It hadn't arrived with a gavel or a sentence. It had slipped in the side door, as softly as the killer once had, and left something harder than resolution. The knowledge that even the most refined appearances can hide the most deliberate harm. She had seen the signs early. The misaligned drawer, the handkerchief with the wrong thread, the doll, too clean, too deliberate, and most of all, Bellamy's politeness. Polished, calm, always one sentence ahead of where people expected him to be. That was his real disguise, not innocence but professionalism. And it had fooled nearly everyone, except her, because Miss Marple had learned long ago that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it smiles, and when it does, she is there, quiet, watchful, and always listening. Autumn had settled fully over St. Mary Mead, crisp and golden, the kind of season that softened even the sharpest memories. The ivy on Sycamore House had turned red along the eaves, and for the first time in weeks, its windows no longer looked like the eyes of a place that had seen too much. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, there was a warmth again. The fireplace, flickering, the kettle murmuring, her knitting basket full once more with half-finished rows. The village had begun to breathe easily again. Agnes had been transferred to a care facility near Devon, her case now in the hands of doctors and judges. The estate matters had passed without fanfare. Life, as it often did in quiet places, had resumed its slow, careful rhythm. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe a story ever ended neatly. She had done her part, unraveled the knot, pulled the threads loose until the truth had no choice but to reveal itself. Bellamy's name would never face the court, but his deception had been quietly documented, and the solicitor now handling Edith Grayson's estate had promised to ensure her final instructions were honored properly this time. The documents Miss Marple found in the garden shed had been forwarded discreetly to the appropriate channels. No headlines, no drama, just correction. And yet something had stayed with her. A lingering detail, small and seemingly irrelevant, like a whisper that refused to quiet down. It had come not from the estate or the evidence, but from Agnes herself. That last night when she'd said with eerie calm, "I just wanted her to be afraid. Make her think about what she'd buried. Not who." What the phrasing had unsettled Miss Marple. And now, days later, as she sat in her chair and let her eyes drift over the garden beyond the frosted window, she found herself returning once more to that forgotten corner of the nursery. Not the drawer, not the chest, but the space behind the bookcase. It had been too heavy to move easily. She hadn't tried, but now something nudged her to revisit it. By mid-morning, she stood once more inside the nursery of Sycamore House. The new estate custodian had agreed to give her temporary access, trusting the request without question. She moved slowly, her hands still steady, her eyes sharper than ever. The bookshelf creaked as she tilted it aside. Dust rose thick and undisturbed, and behind it, just as she had suspected, was a narrow cavity in the wall. Not a hidden door, not a secret passage, just a gap, carefully hollowed, almost child-sized. Inside it, she found a box, not locked, not sealed. She lifted the lid, old letters, dozens of them, some opened, others untouched, all addressed to Frederick Grayson, and one at the very bottom addressed to Edith. The paper was brittle but readable, the handwriting unfamiliar. She scanned it once, then again. The letter wasn't recent. It had been written 20 years ago. And it changed everything. "Edith, I beg you, don't speak to anyone about what you saw. The man isn't who he claims to be. I tried to warn your brother, but he wouldn't listen. There's more at stake than your inheritance or his reputation. If you push too far, they'll come for you. They already have his records. They've taken mine. I'm leaving St. Mary Mead tonight. I'll send word when I can. If anything happens, find the ledger he kept under the floorboard near the hearth. Everything is there." It was unsigned. Miss Marple stepped back slowly, the letter shaking slightly in her hand. The man isn't who he claims to be. Bellamy? Or someone else? And what records? She left Sycamore House with a heavy silence pressing at her chest, the letter folded and tucked into her coat. That evening, she returned to her hearth, lit the fire, and sat for a long time without her knitting, her teacup forgotten. Because it wasn't just that Bellamy had manipulated Edith, or that Agnes had spiraled into revenge. It was that something older, deeper, darker had been buried long before any of them, and someone, somewhere, had tried to silence it. The floorboard near the hearth. She made a note in her diary. Return with gloves, a small pry tool. Quietly. No need to involve the constable, just yet. Outside, the mist had crept back in, soft against the panes. The village, unaware, slept. And in her armchair, Miss Marple leaned back slowly, the corners of her mouth forming the faintest knowing smile. A mystery had ended. But another was just beginning.